Father holding his small white and beige marbled shofar against his pursed lips, waiting for my brother to call out the traditional sequence of notes in a hushed tone, using the Silverman Machzor with its gray cover. With each call, I can see my dad, eyes closed, inhaling deeply and exhaling with great force and intentionality into the small hole of the shofar. When I think about those experiences, it feels to me like my father and my brother were uniquely attuned to each other, to the yearnings of our community, and to the potential power of this embodied act to open all of us who are present to the spiritual and ethical possibilities that this ritual holds. Much as I love to sing and to chant and to discuss the liturgy and the readings biblical for Yamim Noraim, the elemental sounds of the shofar somehow reverberate through me differently, mysteriously, calling forth thoughts and emotions that are otherwise very difficult to access. Adding to the power of the shofar service are the many textual associations that this rite carries with it, from the disquieting episode of the Akedah in Sefer Breshit to the medieval philosophical analysis of the Rambam to the postmodern literary analyses of Aviva Zornberg. In the spring of 2022, I was invited to participate in a fall colloquium at Notre Dame University in celebration of a new interreligious book prize that the university was inaugurating at that time. The winning book was called Sand Talk. It was authored by an Australian Aboriginal writer named Tyson Yunkaporta. As luck or providence would have it, I downloaded the book just as I began my annual preparations for the Yamim Noraim. It was, in fact, Rosh Chodesh Elul. Listening and then reading Sand Talk, I was immediately intrigued by Yunkaporta's practice of carving objects as part of an intentional embodied approach to sharing the wisdom of his peoples and of his non-human kin, past and present. While I have little talent for, and next to no experience with carving, or any crafts for that matter, seeing Yunkaporta's drawings of his woodwork and learning about the ways in which he was attempting to present his distillation of Australian Aboriginal wisdom holistically led me to think anew about the shofar. I was particularly interested in Yunkaporta's description of his braided methodology, what he calls umpan, as it is, quote, our word for cutting, carving, making, and only more recently, writing. That likely sounds familiar to those of you that speak Hebrew. As he further states, quote, my method for writing incorporates images and story attached to place and relationships, expressed first through cultural and social activities. This is precisely what I find so powerful about the shofar, because it is an ancient, indigenous instrument from the Near East that our ancestors have carried to great lengths across their travels, wandering from place to place, often, of course, through forced movement. The shofar has been invested with a variety of meanings. Image and story, as Yunkaporta describes it, echo through the ram's horn to this very day. Put differently, the shofar is a unique Jewish spiritual touchstone that has the power to connect one to different layers of meaning from different places and stages of our religio-cultural development, from the ancient Near East to Brookline, Massachusetts. Inspired by Yunkaporta's bold and insightful presentation of some of the gems from his tradition, I began to renew my relationship with the shofar, sounding it each morning during the month of Elul, which I honestly had not done for some time, looking at various commentaries, sermons, stories, music, and visual art about it. In my renewed engagement with shofar, I came upon a fascinating text about the shofar ritual and intergenerational dynamics by the 18th century Hasidic master, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Selichot, who is the author of the influential homiletical work, Degel Machane Ephraim, the banner of the camp of Ephraim. And, as is my habit, I immediately, after reading this text excitedly, called Eben. The book was published posthumously in 1810, and appended to it, there is this very interesting collection that constitutes a dream diary. And these entries are the very last section of this book of teachings on the weekly Torah portions, the holiday cycle, and other issues. In the very last entry, the Rebbe records a dream he had from early December 1784, involving his late and revered grandfather, none other than the Baal Shem Tov, Yisrael ben Eliezer, who had died in 1760. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim opens his diary entry as follows. And you have the texts in front of you. If you want to listen, feel free. If you want to look at the text, bevakasha. On Thursday night of the week of the Torah portion of Vayeshev, I beheld in a dream my master and elder, my grandfather, ascending to the synagogue platform. He took a shofar in hand and proceeded to sound the traditional sequence of notes. Before each of the sounds, however, he called out the notes himself. The Sudla cover continues by stating that as he watches the Baal Shem Tov, he is thoroughly confused about his own role in this drama. Who wouldn't be? He says, I stood bewildered as to what I should do, since he was calling out the sounds and blowing the shofar himself. Just then, his grandfather summons him to the Amud, albeit in an unexpected way. Quote, he called out, Ya'amod, as is done when calling a person to an aliyah to the Torah. I went up to the platform, stood next to the wide end of the shofar. Eben and I were trying to act this out as we were deciphering the text, and recited a blessing as one does when approaching the Torah scroll. Our preacher does not specify what the words of his bracha were. Did he recite the traditional shofar blessing? But based on the ensuing details in the diary entry, this ritualized exchange, intergenerational, grandfather and grandson, was clearly transformational. The younger Rebbe goes on to say, lo and behold, I found myself standing inside the shofar as sound came forth from it. The call and response between the Baal Shem Tov, who of course was a renowned mystic and magician, and Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim moved the latter from being a bewildered outsider to the very center, literally the center of the shofar experience. So much so that he was now nestled inside the horn itself, feeling the force of the blast with every fiber of his being as it rushed through the instrument. This intriguing moment in the dream calls to mind, especially at this time of year, the scene of the prophet Yonah in the belly of the great sea creature, which is, of course, traditionally read on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. It is in the hollow of the mighty fish that God's reluctant messenger cries out to the divine, and from which Jonah goes forth to the great city of Nineveh. That word great is all over that short text, to proclaim the need for communal tshuva. Without saying anything more about this extraordinary voyage in and out of the shofar, the Sudla cover continues his narration as follows. After this, I took the shofar in hand and went to my house, where I sounded it myself. Empowered by this extraordinary experience inside the horn, The degel takes hold of the shofar, leaves the synagogue, and goes to his own home to continue his prayers. There is no mention of the Baal Shem Tov. He doesn't grant him permission or even bid him farewell. It is as if, with a wink and a smile, the Zayde simply recedes quietly, knowing that his grandson is now prepared to carry out this sacred ritual independently, having truly immersed himself in this ancient and mysterious practice. Surely, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim studied and sought to apply various mystical teachings about the power of the shofar long before this experience. Now, however, he seems to embody it much more fully. At this point in the dream diary, the preacher, using Kabbalistic terminology, offers a brief interpretation of the preceding events. He states confidently that his shofar performance has opened the heavens and drawn forth bracha and shefa, blessing and bounty upon him and many others. Importantly, the Sudla cover includes two brief snippets from subsequent dream scenes, the following morning and the next night. And here again I quote, "As night turned to day, I dreamed again. This time I saw myself wearing a kittel, a festive white robe embroidered with rows of silver and gold. It was truly a regal garment." It seems that our preacher has journeyed in this dreamscape through the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, and now dons a kittel, which of course is worn on Yom Kippur and other special occasions. The depiction of the robe as being both white, a sign of purity, and decorated with silver and gold seems to indicate that Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim has gone through another transformation. Similar to the biblical figure of Mordechai on Purim, the source of the description of the regal garment, he sees himself now as a Ben Melech. He is a person of spiritual nobility. The use of the term regal, of malchut, to describe the kittel also suggests that he feels the indwelling presence of the divine, Shekhinah, or malchut, as she is often referred to in Kabbalistic language, surrounding, filling, and emanating from him as he did in the hollow of the shofar. Given the flow of the dream sequence, this brief scene seems to confirm the Sudla cover's emergence as an independent and inspired spiritual actor, following in the footsteps of his grandfather and a host of other visionaries going all the way back to Jonah and other biblical figures. Interestingly, biographically, historically, the Degel did forge his own leadership path, and it took time. It was a complicated journey for him. He was quite different than his illustrious grandfather. The Baal Shem Tov, as you probably know, was a renowned folk healer, a prayer leader, an oral teacher who advocated publicly for the Jewish community. The Degel was a much more retiring, scholarly teacher and preacher who we mostly know about from this very collection of texts. In one last act of time travel, the rabbi states that same Friday night he saw in a dream, the third now in this sequence, that he was celebrating Shmini Atzeret, the last day of the fall holiday. Fittingly, his grandfather now reappears. Quote, "Not only did I see myself rejoicing greatly, but so too was my master and elder, my grandfather." The Baal Shem Tov and the Degel, reunited, are now both full initiates into the mysteries of the shofar, celebrate this sacred occasion together. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim then adds a second interpretive note, reiterating that his visions all point to a quote-unquote sweetening of the judgments, hamtakat hadinim, that the act of sounding the shofar is not only renewing and restoring to him and his community, but that it is a herald of a future global redemption. With that, the Hasidic master ends his final dream entry and his entire book of teachings, having taken us on a journey from waking to dream consciousness, a little like tonight, and from December 1784 back through the course of the fall Jewish holiday season. In keeping with various mystical teachings, he seems to have extended the period of Tshuva to Shmini Atzeret, or even to the edge of Chanukah, because for Mekubalim and then for Hasidim, it's never over. In fact, Chanukah that year was celebrated 1 week after the sequence of dreams as reported in this book. In exploring this evocative and densely symbolic text, I found myself reflecting on a second foundational element from my new colleague, Tyson Young-Caporta's Sand Talk, which he calls story mind. As he states, narrative is the most powerful mechanism for memory. While isolated facts go only to short-term memory, with repetition, as with the study of exams, stories go immediately to long-term memory. This is part of what I believe makes the dream diary text so powerful. In recounting his imaginal journey through the fall holiday season, the Degel tells a compact and compelling story about his relationship to his grandfather, his own evolving role as a Hasidic master, and the relationship of the Jewish people to the divine, all through that little opening of the shofar, so to speak. In so doing, the subject cover also invites all of us to view ourselves as part of a cosmic narrative in which we have the potential to renew our personal, communal, and global relationships. How so? By investing ritually, both intentionally and imaginatively, in these ancestral traditions. This includes, of course, a heightened awareness to the texture of time. Most fundamentally, there is an organic relationship that he is highlighting between the unfolding of the Jewish liturgical calendar and the seasons of the year. To everything, there is a season. Turn, turn, turn. In a manner similar to what Young-Caporta describes as innovation through the demotic, not demonic, but demotic. The Degel offers us a fresh perspective on a series of established and time-honored rituals, thus simultaneously connecting us to past, present, and future, as is the role of shamanistic figures across many spiritual traditions. And of course, this creative exegetical method aligns seamlessly with the watchword of our Yamim Noraim, which is Tshuva. For the goal of this liminal season, after all, this fall season, is to engage in an honest assessment of our behaviors and to recommit ourselves to growth and refinement in the new year. We turn back, we turn in, we turn out, and then we turn forward. Here I want to introduce another quote from Young-Caporta that I think helps to further enrich this exploration. There is more to narrative than simply telling our stories. We have to compare our stories with the stories of others to seek greater understanding about our reality. There has to be an exchange of stories if you want to be awake and grown. I love those last two statements, awake and grown. This is wise counsel for anyone interested in genuine encounter and feels particularly relevant in this moment as we are living in such a deeply polarized world. Furthermore, it feels important to make this statement as I'm also sharing a text from an 18th century Hasidic master, because in this beautiful but human corpus, there are many, many negative statements about those that stand outside the sacred circle, which is to say, the non-Jewish world. The Rebbe of Selichot and his community lived in a time and place, of course, in which Jews had limited rights and privileges and were regularly spoken of as benighted and superseded by their Christian neighbors. Following earlier rabbinic voices of protest, the Hasidim regularly fought back, as it were, exegetically, by insisting through commentary on the spiritual superiority of Jews and of their exceptional role, however mysterious, in the redemption of the world. And here it's treated lightly, but it is obvious who will bring about the sounding of that great eschatological shofar blast reference in the book of Isaiah. Of course, I recognize fully the painful and precarious reality in which our forebears lived in the Pale of Settlement. But I also think that it's very important, especially now as we're engaged in this process of cheshbon nefesh, to challenge chauvinistic and triumphalist narratives, particularly because some of these very same texts are being used tonight in different Jewish communities throughout the world as sources to attest to Jewish superiority. To quote Yanka Porta once more, quote, "This brings us back to the foundational flaw present in so many religious and cultural communities. I am greater than you. You are less than me." In such a zero-sum context, it's impossible to have a genuine exchange of stories in which two or more parties seek greater understanding of their intersecting realities through mutual learning and growth. I want to make it clear that in pointing out this criticism, I am in no way interested in canceling Hasidism or any Hasidic masters. I don't want to distance myself from them, but I want to engage in an honest process of berur, as they would call it, of sifting and sorting and clarifying in the spirit of this season. And in fact, I'm inspired to a large extent because of their creative displays in their own teachings. Could you imagine, whether in a dream or a sermon, inviting us into the hollow of the shofar? And so, like them, I think that we are responsible to read these texts in renewed, sometimes unexpected ways. And so here I want to share with you a second story about shofar. It's a briefer story, but one that is important to me, and I think in some obvious ways to this community. It comes from the Neo-Hasidic Rabbi, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory. Reb Zalman, as he is affectionately known, for any of you that don't know who he is, was trained, of course, as a Chabad Lubavitch rabbi, began his career as an Orthodox practitioner, and then took a left turn. And he zigged and he zagged, and of course eventually became perhaps the most significant heterodox spiritual teacher of the last 50 years in North America, combining, of course, elements of Hasidism and American counterculture. And some of you here lived through it. Here's Reb Zalman's story, which took place in the 1970s in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. A few years ago, I participated in a symposium on mysticism with spokesmen from several other traditions. It was the 1970s, so the word spokesman, I think, is accurate. Among us was a medicine man from the Blood Indian Reservation named Brother Rufus Goodstriker. We were all put up at a modern plastic hotel, a place which didn't seem to hold much promise for a group of mystics. But the setting was glorious. To the east, the Canadian prairies for miles, including my home city of Winnipeg. To the west, the Canadian Rockies soared into the sky. Reb Zalman, ever the spiritual explorer, or spiritual peeping Tom, as he sometimes self-mockingly referred to himself, decided that he was going to seek an outdoor space to pray Shachrit. So he headed to the motel roof He took his talis, his tefillin, his shofar, and ascended by elevator to the rooftop. There he managed to open the emergency exit door without sounding the alarm. As he reports, the roof was a forest of air conditioners, vent pipes, and chimneys, but I found myself a corner facing east towards Yerushalayim and began to get into my prayers. I love his folksy rendition of the experience. As the sun rose and the rabbi took in the beautiful scenery, he became entranced in prayer. After several minutes, he looks up. Lo and behold, who has joined him on the rooftop? It's none other than Brother Rufus. He too had a small bundle under his arm, says Reb Zalman. We acknowledged each other's presence with wordless nods. He also took up a position facing east and began to perform his morning ritual. Reb Zalman then goes on to say the following. First, he took out a prayer blanket, which reminded me of my prayer tabs, of my talit. Then lit a small charcoal fire, offered some incense, and made a burnt offering of a pinch of meal or flour. Facing the east with his arms raised in the air, he swayed back and forth, chanting in a language I did not understand. But I didn't have to understand the language to know that he was calling out to God. At the moment of sunrise, he placed a small whistle to his lips and blew a sharp note in every direction. When both men finished their morning rituals, Brother Rufus approached his rabbinic counterpart and asked gently, "May I please see your instruments?" As Reb Zalman notes, as Brother Rufus examined each of the objects, the shaman, the medicine man, nodded and I saw respect on his face. Reb Zalman was particularly moved when Brother Rufus inspected his tzitzit and said as follows, "What's the message?" This revealed his new companion's understanding that, quote, such designs are not random, but very deliberate. Reb Zalman adds one more important detail about his enlightening rooftop interreligious dialogue. After a few moments, he picked up the shofar and looked at it. Ram's horn. We use a whistle made from an eagle bone. May I blow it? He blew a few loud notes through the ram's horn, handed it back, and simply said, of course, it's much better than a cow. For a moment I thought, better for what? But Brother Rufus was a shaman, a medicine man. He knew that you blow animal bones to blow the demons away, to clear the air, to connect with God, to bring about change, to say to the sleeping soul, like the Rambam, hey, you, there, wake up. Pay attention. In closing the story, our Rebbe adds one final thought. At every step of his examination of my sacred prayer tools, Brother Rufus asked the right questions. The questions are usually more important than the answers. He was in tune with the technology of religious artifacts and understood them. He, coming from a very different world, approached my religious instruments as if they were not so different from his own. For me, part of the power of the story is that Reb Zalman has so internalized the method of Hasidic storytelling that he applies it to his own life experiences. Any of you that were ever in Reb Zalman's presence know that he was a consummate storyteller. Whether the events happened or not, beside the point. This anecdote, in fact, reads like many journeys told by Hasidim, including the Selichot, some of which in earlier Hasidic storytelling involve interactions with non-Jews. At the same time, this story differs from many classic Hasidic teachings, stories, homilies, etc., as they often convey a triumphalist message as it relates to the religious other. In this Neo-Hasidic story, Reb Zalman consciously advocates for what he called a post-triumphalist position, or what I would call an ethos of textured pluralism, in which spiritual practitioners from different traditions explore their similarities and differences, both with respect and curiosity. Neither man in the story has the need to prove that the other is superior or inferior. As Reb Zalman states, he and Brother Rufus came from very different worlds, but also recognize that they were both involved in related holy endeavors. Otherwise, these two men would not have found themselves standing on the rooftop of a plastic motel at sunrise, bowing, bending, chanting, and blowing animal bones, and then exchanging notes on, quote, the technology of religious artifacts. This brings me to my final point and to the third and final text that you have in front of you or near you. And it brings us back to the Degel Machane Ephraim. Our preacher opens this brief sermonette with a quotation from Numbers 10:7. When you assemble the community, sound a tekiah and not a truah. I think I also shared this text with you, Eben. Why a tekiah and not a truah? Because, as the Degel explains, it is inevitable that each and every one of us will at some point find ourselves in a state of katnut, of psychospiritual diminishment or constriction. In such moments, counsels the Degel, turn to others for help and support, knowing that there are other people in your orbit who in that same moment are in states of gadlut, of expansiveness or largesse spiritually. In other words, be humble and wise enough to seek out their guidance and know that in times in the future, these roles will likely be reversed. In other words, be a part of assembling a community. The Degel goes on to say, that is why the Torah states, sound a tekiah and not a truah, meaning, do not think of yourself as being in a splintered and diminished state, in a state of shvirah. Rather, fashion, connection, and unity, which is, says the Degel, the attribute of chesed, of tekiah, one unbroken, continuous, flowing sound, and not deen, judgment, or sternness and katnut. And then he says, this is the meaning of and not a truah. We do not need, in such moments, a series of broken or staccato notes. In an unexpected way, this is exactly what my colleague, Tyson Yankaporta, did for me 2+ years ago. In inviting me to learn about his sacred traditions, he also helped me rediscover the beauty in my own tradition. And listening to and reading his book and engaging with him in open-hearted dialogue, Tyson inspired me to explore the power of the shofar, and by extension, the Yamim Noraim, in a new and renewed way. Frankly speaking, in the midst of COVID, with a lot of anxiety, some depression, and bewilderment, I had become a nerd, and I was less than enthusiastic about picking up the shofar and preparing for the Yamim Noraim. I needed to be in conversation with someone who was experiencing gadlut. I was in a place of katnut. In this case, it happened to be, or providentially was, an Australian Aboriginal writer and artist. And of course, this is why we are all gathered here tonight. This is why we assemble as a community or a cluster of communities at this awesome time of year to support one another in our individual and shared processes of tshuva. We come together to feel a little less splintered, a little less fragmented, a little less adrift in a world in which there is far too much pain and suffering, and in which we human beings cause one another far too much pain and suffering. As the Selichot describes it, we are here to allow chesed to flow a little more freely. There is always need for deen, for gvura, for yirah, But in a world that is so aching for reconnection, let's start tonight or tomorrow by sounding one extended, unbroken tki'ah, allowing compassion to fill the air and to heal our wounded hearts. May our renewed efforts at tshuva during these yamim noraim inspire us to fulfill the enduring dream of lovingly sounding the great shofar of redemption for all. Thank you. I'm going to literally get off my soapbox. Happy to engage in a little bit of conversation, hear what some of you thought or felt about any of these texts. And I think next, we're going to stop talking and actually sing.
Thank you. Very moved by your teaching. And I actually felt a strong connection between the initial dream and then at the end with the teaching of the Kiyah, the whole, in fact, personally feeling immersed in the Kiyah of wholeness that can enable me to then also vibrate with the Shvarim and the Shua of the brokenness and blessing and love. And it all really got so get close to that by the end of the Yom Kippur. The Shofarot.
So nothing that it's in the non-microphone can be heard. Yes, thank you.
We can also return to the silent meditation. Noah, would you hit us with Olam Chesed Yibaneh?
Olam chesed yibaneh, yadadai, ay, ay, yadadai, ay. Olam chesed yibaneh, yadadai, ay, 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 ay. Olam chesed yibaneh, yadadai, ay, 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 ay. Olam chesed yibaneh, ay, 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 ay. world from love. Ay, 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 ay. Olam chesed yivaneh. Oh, Adonai. Ay, 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 ay. Olam chesed yivaneh. Oh, Adonai. Ay, 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 ay. Oh, Olam chesed yivaneh. Adonai. Ay, 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 ay. Oh, Olam chesed yivaneh. Adonai. Ay, ay. Oh. Thank you, Rabbi Orr, for your teaching. We'll have a 10-minute hafsaka.